In this lesson, we'll talk about the creation of web standards. In our last lesson, we started talking about some of the consequences of the browser wars and that developers had to either choose to support one browser or the other, or to create completely different versions of websites that would work in both Internet Explorer or in Netscape Navigator. So this led to a lot of frustration in the direction of the internet. And so this led to the creation of something called web standards, in which an organization was created to oversee web standards. And in 1994, this was created by Tim Berners-Lee, and he created what he called the W3C, or the World Wide Web Consortium. And they were created to make recommendations for both developers and browsers to prevent things like the browser wars, in which there was all this proprietary technology, there was no cross-compatibility or backwards compatibility or future compatibility either. There was nothing to guarantee that a website you created today would work in the past or the future or in any other software. The downside of this was that there was no real reason for people to care. The average user had no knowledge that this was really going on, and there was no incentive from the average user to put pressure on browsers to follow standards. During this time, the standards that were released, even if no one really followed them, were HTML 4.01 and CSS 1.0 and 2.0, which are technologies we'll learn about in a later lesson. And one of the main goals of the W3C was to create a web for all. And I really love this quote that shows the nobility that was behind the incentive to create something like web standards. And that was that the social value of the web is that it enables human communication, commerce, and opportunities to share knowledge. One of the W3C's primary goals is to make these benefits available to all people, whatever their hardware, software, network infrastructure, native language, culture, geographical location, or physical or mental ability. So what a huge and noble goal to make sure that all this information, which has so much potential to change lives, to connect individual humans, to allow people to do things through the internet, to make that available to anyone, anywhere in the world, was the main goal of the W3C. So very noble goal. But if you had to take one guess what Netscape and Internet Explorer had to say about that, what do you think they would say to something like a set of guidelines that were suggested to them that would change the way they're competing and arbitrarily adding features with no regard to old versions or new versions or websites that work in other browsers? Well, they said, you can't tell us what to do. So this led to a lot of frustration in developers and people who are working on the internet. So this led to the creation of something called the Web Standards Project, which consisted of a group of frustrated web developers and designers banding together to create this project and try to put pressure to get browsers to follow web standards. And one of the results of this was changing the W3C's terminology from recommendations to standards. So recommendations sounds more like, maybe you can follow this if you want to, maybe not. Standards really sounds more like guidelines or things to live up to. And the W3C also created an advisory board consisting of companies that work on things like web browsers, and started to allow more people to come in and assist with the creation and the management of these guidelines. And the Web Standards Project tried to grow awareness of standards in several ways to increase the pressure on companies to follow them. And this came in the form of advertising on websites that were aimed at people who are development focused, and also by bullying members of the W3C, not the organization itself who had that noble goal, but the companies who participated, who were companies like Microsoft, like Apple, a lot of the tech giants at the time, and trying to get them to follow web standards. In 2000, there were several things that led to the growth of web standards in addition to the web standard projects. And at this time, Microsoft released IE5, which was a Macintosh edition, and it was made the default browser on Mac's operating system. And it actually had decent support of web standards at the time, and it made developers and designers more comfortable with adhering to web standards since this was a completely new way of creating websites. So the Web Standards Project encourages companies to make future releases as well with web standards in mind, which help encourage its use. In 2001, so the next year, A List Apart, which is a famous web design and development focused blog, they redesigned their website and they published an article encouraging developers and designers to adopt web standards as well. So they redesigned their website with web standards in mind. And then there was another man who was also behind the creation of things like A List Apart, who helped increase the knowledge of web standards in designers and developers. And he wrote a book called Designing with Web Standards, along with a man named Ethan Marquette, to help increase the knowledge and awareness of web standards and help teach people how they could adopt them in their own process. This combined with the creation of another website, CSS Zen Garden, in 2003, helped continue increase the awareness of web standards, and that it showed people that HTML, or hypertext markup language, which helps create the structure of a website, it could be combined with CSS. And just by editing the CSS, the cascading style sheets, which controls the presentation of a website, you could dramatically change the look of HTML. So here you see the exact same HTML style differently only by changing the CSS. And at this time, it was a pretty crazy idea, and a lot of people weren't aware that this was possible because presentation was mixed in with the HTML. It wasn't separated. So changing the styling and the look of a web page was a much more difficult task. You had to dig through all of that HTML to make these changes rather than being able to only touch an external presentational style sheet. So over time, more and more browsers started conforming to web standards, and developers and designers started making standards compliant websites. So this was a happy time for all by adopting web standards. So in our next lesson, we're going to talk about what exactly web standards are and take a look at the different kinds of guidelines that are proposed by organizations like the W3C.